Richard White picked up an old camera at 15, and ever since then, he was hooked. Photography was his passion, and it's what drove him to learn how to rough it out in the wild. Before that camera, he'd never shown any inclination toward camping, hiking, or anything to do with nature. But that lens made the world come alive in a way that he'd never seen before. He never intended to make a living from it, but the passion kept him tethered, his mind healthy, and his mundane job at a pharmaceutical company bearable. As long as he could look forward to a camping trip planned on his calendar at all times, he was happy. Now at the age of 49, he'd long since graduated from going with hiking groups and camping with friends. He was happy enough to set out alone and disappear into the wilderness for a few days by himself. His wife and teenage daughter had gotten used to his absences every few months. Lucy, who was now 15, had started showing an interest in the lens too, and though she accompanied her father on short day trips around their home in San Diego, this trip wasn't one of those. Richard was going to Alaska's Denali National Park, and this 3-day expedition was a little too much for Lucy just yet. Not that Richard minded, he had a special place in his heart for Denali. He'd been there 3 times before, and to him, there was nothing quite like the silence and the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. This was also his last chance to visit the place before the deep Alaskan winter set in, leaving snow so deep that sections of the park closes down completely. September and August were the best times to come anyway. The animals scurried about in a last attempt to store food for the long winter ahead, and to eat whatever greenery was left before the frozen wasteland took the last edible morsels away. Everything living was out and about, the bears, lynxes, bucks, squirrels, and everything, just waiting to be captured for eternity on Richard's memory card. Richard kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and set out for Denali. When he pulled in, he picked out a spot to erect his tent and loaded everything inside, his food, sleeping bags, and all. He wasn't planning on spending much time at the camp. The next 3 days he was going to be out taking pictures until the sun went down. The drive had been a long one, and he barely had enough time to get his tent set up before it got dark, but he still managed to take a few snaps of the sunset at least. The next morning, Richard wolfed down breakfast and set out with his camera around his neck and his backpack full of snacks and drinks. The morning began just as he'd planned. As the sun rose, the wilderness came alive. Both small and large animals came out in hopes of getting their paws on as much food as they could in a single day. By the time the afternoon came around, Richard settled next to a river beside a clump of willows for a bite to eat. Before long, a buck came out of the trees for a drink of water. Then the birds rose from the trees, and even a massive moose made an appearance. Richard knew that if he camped out here all day, he'd get more footage than most other places in the park. But he never expected to catch a glimpse of the majestic grizzly bear. To Richard's absolute delight, a half-ton male lumbered out of the thicket of willows. He headed straight for a clutch of berry bushes just 60 feet away from where Richard was sitting, and began to pick them off with a surprising amount of finesse for such a large animal. As it picked the bush clean, Richard snapped one picture after the other, and he just couldn't believe his luck. The animal was now only 40 feet away, and still blissfully unaware of Richard's presence. Richard assumed that it saw him the moment it came out of the trees, but that it was choosing to ignore him, sitting so still in the distance. He'd run across bears from time to time, and they'd always preferred to keep their distance all on their own. But when this specimen of a bear came into the 40-yard range, Richard became a little unnerved. He'd never been so close to a bear before, and he doubted that it would come so close to him voluntarily. But now Richard was stuck where he was. He didn't want to move and startle the creature, fearing that could set off an unprovoked attack. So he remained where he was, continuing to take pictures and hoping that it would venture off on its own when the bushes were finally cleared of food. Richard was right to be worried about the small distance between them. He made a slight adjustment to get his legs in a more comfortable position, and and accidentally crushed a cereal bar wrapper beneath his foot. The sound made the bear look up, just as Richard snapped a shot of it looking straight into the camera. It saw Richard and tentatively moved toward the strange creature that was so close. Another picture, this time only 35 yards away, and another at 30 yards. Then Richard's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming in to investigate anymore. The bear was now running straight at him. He dropped his camera, left his bag, and began to sprint toward the water. It was the only place to go. There was no outrunning the pounding paws behind his back. At least in the water, Richard might be able to swim faster than the bear. The sound of the bear's pounding paws behind him was now accompanied by the deep huffing of the massive animal's lungs. It was closing in. Richard pumped his legs harder than he thought was possible. He didn't take the time to look back. He knew it was nearly on top of him. The pounding and the breathing was now accompanied by an earth-shattering growl, and then his legs folded beneath him as half a ton of pure murderous rage descended on top of him. It was only then that Richard uttered his first scream. At the exact same time, the bear's enormous claws ripped through his jacket. The grizzly began tearing at his flesh and raking him across the ground in a full-blown attack. The birds took flight from the reeds as Richard's screams punctured the air. No longer satisfied with clawing at the man's back, the animal picked Richard up and threw him over, spinning him through the air. Richard's torn-up back hit the dirt. Before he could even comprehend what to do in this life-threatening situation, the bear was on top of him again. This time, a set of nails grabbed his head, tearing through his scalp and cheek, and its jaws clamped down on his neck and shoulder. Richard's neck broke almost instantly. He had a quick flash of the most blinding pain he'd ever experienced in his life before the world went suddenly dark and Richard was no more. In a lot of ways, Richard was lucky. At least his death was relatively quick, and he wasn't aware of the next 15 minutes of hell his body went through. The grizzly continued to shake and tear at Richard's body. It ripped off his jacket and shirt, slashed at his abdomen, and almost entirely tore his scalp away from his skull. When the bear had finally expended all of its energy, it dragged Richard to a cache just 200 yards away, leaving a trail of insides that spilled out of Richard's torn abdomen. There, it buried him beneath the rest of the food it planned on eating over the next few days. Only 2 hours later, a group of hikers came upon Richard's discarded backpack, camera, shreds of clothes, and enough blood and gore to make the scene look like something out of a slasher movie. They ran 3 miles to the nearest station, and helicopters and rangers were deployed before the sun even began to go down. They only had to follow the bloody trail a short distance to find Richard's remains. But the bear guarding it posed a serious problem. It ran off into the woods when they approached, but darkening skies made visibility almost zero, and the shots that were fired all missed. So they returned the next day. From the air, they could identify 5 separate bears, but it was the one who kept coming back to the cache wanting to attack them that was deemed the culprit. It took 3 shots to down the 600-pound full-grown grizzly. The necropsy quickly determined that he was indeed the animal who had been feeding on Richard, but it was the camera that held the most chilling details. Though never released to the public, the officers described it as 5 final photographs of the animal becoming aware of its watcher, and for those 5 frames, looking dead straight into the lens of the camera, it came closer and closer and closer, capturing the few seconds before Richard White met his terrifying final affliction. September in Alaska is one of the most picturesque times of the year to visit the state. It's the month where summer just starts to lose its hold. The landscape turns crisp and clear, and it's sprinkled with the orange and yellow hues of autumn. This is also the final flurry of activity in the vast wilderness. Animals hurry to finish their winter dens and to eat what last living morsels are left growing to build up as much fat as they can for the long winter months ahead. Once the winter truly settles in, both animals and humans are confined by the snow and ice that blanket the landscape. Robert Harris Weaver or Chupa as his friends liked to call him, and his wife Nenah were taking advantage of the last of the good weather that September. Robert was an Alaskan native. The only time he'd left his home state for an extended period of time was to attend university. But once he got his degree and met Nenah, he and his new wife came back to Robert's home. There, they'd raised their children, and Robert took over his old man's business. Now that the children were grown and out of the house, raising kids of their own, Robert was slowly phasing out of the family business, handing it over to his son, just like his father had done before him. Robert and Nenah had the leisure of going hunting, fishing, or just staying at their cabin beside Lake George whenever they felt like it. However, this trip was a special one. Robert wanted to catch the last phase of the hunting season, hoping to bring down a moose for himself and maybe a few more to hand out to his grown-up children. They also planned to check on the cabin to get some last-minute repairs done and drop off a few supplies before the first snowfall of the season. After the season came to an end and the snowfall became too deep to navigate through, he and Nenah were going to spend their first ever winter in their cabin alone. In the years before, their trips were always with their children or friends, and then only in the spring and summer. But since they were technically retired now, they wanted to have an unconventional second honeymoon by trapping themselves inside the comfy cabin for the whole winter, with only each other for company. In 2013, they didn't have the internet and satellites that we have today, so they were going to be severely limited in the amount of contact they could have with the outside world. But both of them were fit and healthy, so they weren't too worried about running into trouble. In the event that something were to happen to one of them, at least they had a satellite phone to call for help if they had to. And the ancient cell phones of the day did get signal from inside the cabin. The rest of their food, books, generators, and board games were already at the cabin, just waiting for the winter, so that they could be cracked open and enjoyed. If their hunt went well tomorrow, the two would return to town for the next few weeks, before coming back with the last of their supplies, just in time to lock themselves in for winter. On their second-to-last morning on the lake, the two headed out to go fishing before everything froze over solid. They came back to shore in the early afternoon. The cabin was just a short walk from the dock, but even so, it was already cold enough to want to get indoors before the late afternoon, when the temperature dropped and predators like wolves and lynxes had a habit of prowling around the lakeside. Robert had left his hunting rifle up at the cabin, and he didn't like the idea of being caught out in the open without a weapon to defend himself and his wife. Their thoughts of predators weren't unfounded at all. The area was known to have just about every animal in North America, and the extra activity that the autumn brought for the wildlife also came with the pre-winter jitters that animals had when they were hurrying to settle down, and they could be quite unpredictable at this time of year. They tied their boat to the dock and started to make their way back home. Robert was carrying the fishing poles and the tackle box, and Nenah had her 2 buckets of fish. They chatted as they walked and kept their eyes on the uneven ground before them. It was easy to take a tumble over a rock or twist your ankle in an indentation in the ground. They walked about 100 yards up the slightly sloping hill before they started moving through bushes and the first growth of the forest. Another 50 yards ahead, in the thick of the trees, stood their 2-bedroom log house, almost completely hidden from view. A few hours before they arrived, an old male black bear had begun to poke around the place. It came from the forest that morning when it caught a whiff of something edible. The old bear found 2 trash cans and spent the morning ripping open the bags, rummaging through the contents, and eating whatever it could find. By the time Nenah and Robert came back, the bear had left a mess of strewn garbage at the back of the cabin, and it was quite annoyed. The food sure smelled promising all the way out in the forest, but there was so little in the plastic bins that its stomach wasn't even close to capacity. It had wasted all of the morning on just a few scraps, and now it had to start looking for food all over again this late in the day. Just as it was about to leave, it caught the scent of something else. Fish. The bear smelled Nenah's catch long before it even heard the couple's approach. It was just picking up speed, jogging toward the smell, when it stopped short at the sight of the people walking toward it. Nenah and Robert both had their heads down and didn't notice the animal standing in the crop of trees. For a moment, the bear took in the situation. It was hungry, and Nenah definitely carried the source of the promising smell. But black bears preferred to avoid humans if they could. The old bear wasn't stupid. It knew very well that people might seem small and weak, but they were an unpredictable species, and this kind of bear was naturally wired to avoid them when they could. Standing very still, the male mulled over what to do, but before he could make up his mind, the people were coming dangerously close to where he was standing. It was becoming increasingly nervous about their proximity, and the added smell of fish was grating on his senses, adding fuel to the winter jitters. The people were now just a few meters away from the unstable bear, which reared on its hind legs, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Nenah and Robert nearly jumped out of their skin at the sudden blast of sound from the trees. The bear stormed forward a few feet, trying to show off as much of its 230 pounds as it could in the hopes of intimidating them. It still wasn't quite sure how to approach the situation, so it waited for them to make the first move. Apparently, they reacted the wrong way. Nenah was slightly ahead of her husband when she dropped her 2 buckets, spilling the contents over the rocks beneath her feet, and she screamed. Robert rushed forward, placing himself between the animal and his wife, yelling and waving his arms as he went. This wasn't the first time Robert had come across a black bear, and all of them, even the ones as big as this one, ran away if you made enough noise, but he'd never walked into one head-on. The creature saw this as a direct attack, and its instincts took over. Its velvet coat shook majestically as it sped over the ground at the man who was posing the greatest threat. It streaked at an alarming speed, covering the 12 or so meters between them in just a few strides. Robert managed to shout at Nenah to run just before the bear's massive body slammed into him, forcing the air out of his lungs and sending him crashing into the ground. The bear and man skidded across the rocky lakeshore, the jagged rocks tearing away the back of Robert's jacket as they went. Nenah ran, and she didn't look back to see the animal on top of her husband, tearing with its paws and teeth at Robert's chest and head. But she did hear his agonized screams and the murderous growls and roars from the bear behind her. Nenah reached the cabin in seconds, yanked open the door, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. Nenah was confident enough with the rifle. She'd had many turns during target practice, but she'd never actually had to use the weapon to bring anything down. Running and fumbling with it, she loaded the rifle as she made her way back to where Robert was. But when the scene came into view, her stomach dropped. The man laying on the ground was no longer recognizable as Robert. His entire upper body had been mauled so badly that there was little left to see of him except copious amounts of blood and the shreds that were once his face. The animal was still on top of Robert, and somehow Robert was still alive, his arms feebly grabbing onto whatever piece of fur he could. In the seconds that Nenah had taken to get the gun and come back, Robert's screams had turned into bloody gurgles and painful gasps. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. The gun was jammed tight, so she struck the nose of it against a nearby rock and fired again and again and again. Still nothing, just that empty click. Nenah, desperate and panicked, threw the entire gun at the creature. When the heavy metal shaft hit the bear, it lifted Robert, who had now stopped moving, into the air by its jaws and threw him aside. Robert landed with the dead weight of a stone several feet away. Nenah grabbed one of her plastic buckets and threw that at the bear too. Enraged beyond reason, the animal then rushed at Nenah. With only seconds to react, she managed to get hold of a sizable rock and threw it at the approaching creature, hitting it square on the forehead. That last stone saved Nenah's life. The beast was momentarily dazed as she realized just how close it was to her. She could smell the earth and blood on its body and see the chunks of her husband's skin stuck in its muzzle. Nenah did the only wise thing she could. She ran. She didn't look back. She knew she only had a few seconds before the animal came to its senses. The rock was just enough to buy her those precious few seconds, and she pumped her legs harder than she had ever done in her life. She skidded through the open door of their cabin, shutting it behind her. The bear had turned back to Robert when it shook off the blow, Seeing that the woman was nearly at the house, it didn't bother to go after her, not when the other one was already taken care of. Inside the log building, Nenah scrambled to find her cell phone. The satellite phone that they carried for emergencies was strapped to Robert's belt, and there was no way to get it now. She found it and dialed 911. Before the operator answered, Nenah was at the window, but the bear and Robert were both gone. Even from a distance, she could see the bloody drag marks that led into the forest. Sobbing and nearly incoherent, she tried to explain what had happened to the woman who finally picked up at the other end of the line. It took a good 10 minutes before the operator had some idea of the situation and a rough set of directions to get to the secluded place in the Alaskan wilderness. This garbled set of instructions, given by the hysterical Nenah, made it difficult for emergency helicopters to locate the cabin. But from the air, the pilots spotted their blue Jeep standing out against the green and yellow of the autumn trees. By that time, it was already evening, and poor Nenah was still huddled with her back to the door. She was taken away by air to be treated for shock at the closest hospital, even before the search for Robert began. All through the night and well into the next morning, rescue personnel and almost every person in a 50-mile radius of the lake came out to help. By the light of day, they could follow the bloody trail and finally locate Robert's remains hidden in a dugout den. The animal had obviously feasted on the man through the night, but there was no sign of the bear yet, so the search was widened. If bears attack once, the likelihood of them doing it again is almost certain. They couldn't take any chances. But in the end, the bear found them first. It came back to continue its feeding on Robert's remains, only to find a trooper standing at his hidey hole, and its kill was gone, taken away to the morgue the night before. The animal knew, after killing Robert, that this was an opportunity for another easy meal to add to its winter stash. But unfortunately for the black bear, this trooper did not have a rifle that jammed at the wrong moment. He became aware of the movement behind him and discovered the animal obviously stalking him, ready to pounce on the man from behind. When the other searchers and troopers heard the 4 shots ring out across the forest, they converged to the source of the blasts. They found the trooper alive and well, with a fully grown black bear lying dead at his feet. It was later confirmed with a necropsy that the animal indeed had Robert's remains in its digestive tract, so at the very least the danger was removed from the area. But the lake stood devoid of people for almost 2 years anyway. Nenah gave the cabin and surrounding property over to her children, but they didn't want to set foot in the place where their father had died either. So, in the end, it was sold off to another family who still makes use of it to this very day. But thankfully, no bear attacks have occurred there since Robert's terrifying final affliction. Erin Johnson was 27 years old. She had graduated from Chichagof High School in 2007 and had gone on to study geology and botany at the University of Montana and Anchorage, Alaska. She was adventurous and loved the outdoors. She had a passion for Nordic skiing and excelled in the sport, going on to represent the USA in the Junior Olympic Nordic ski team in 2006 and 2007. Her passion for the outdoors and adventure was reflected in the career she embarked on. She worked for Alaska Biological Research, putting her studies to good use as a field technician. On June 19, 2017, she was assigned to work at Pogo Mine. The mine, situated 90 miles east of Fairbanks in Alaska, is a gold mine that has been operating since 2006. It was owned by Japanese mining companies Sumitomo Metal Mining and Sumitomo Corporation, but has since changed hands to Australian gold producer Northern Star Resources. Erin's job was to collect geological samples from the land around the mine. The mine employs contractors to conduct work at its sites, but being very much in bear country, it ensures anyone working for it undergoes practical bear training. Employees are taught how to safely and effectively use bear spray and have the option of carrying a rifle into the field with them too. No one is sent out to work alone, as it is considered too dangerous. 6 people were employed to conduct field work on that fateful day in June. They were paired off to ensure each other's safety, and Aaron was paired with 38-year-old Ellen Trainer from Fairbanks. The employees were transported by helicopter to their respective sites and began work. The whole group was in radio contact with one another as they were dropped off into the wilderness in their pairs. Unfortunately for Aaron and Ellen, the helicopter had just dropped them a short distance from a very hungry male black bear. Aaron and Ellen got to work. They collected soil samples along a transect that could then be analyzed for different components back in the labs. They needed to record the exact location of each sample, as well take detailed notes regarding the surrounding vegetation, soil structure, and pH. It was an incredible place to work. Being in the outdoors, conducting scientific research, was better than any desk job, and the 2 like-minded women hit it off straight away. But being so focused on taking the soil samples, they didn't notice a predator approaching them from downwind. The male black bear had smelt them from a long way off and had crept closer to investigate. When it spotted the 2 women, it changed into predatory mode. It moved silently through the trees, standing stock still whenever the women stood up or turned to look in his direction. It was hidden by the wide tree trunks. Any sound of his approach was muted by the breeze rattling the branches and the quiet chatter of the 2 women as they worked. The bear was cunning. He approached the pair from behind, out of their line of sight. At the time, Aaron and Ellen were talking about the presence of bears in the area. They had completed the most recent round of bear training only 2 months earlier. They discussed the action they should take if they did come across a bear. Little did they know that their training was about to be put to the test as the bear moved closer. It managed to get within 3 meters of the 2 workers before they saw it. Aaron and Ellen looked up at the imposing figure of the black bear. He was staring at them, and their eyes locked. They were in a vulnerable position, both crouched on the ground collecting samples. Their hearts thundered in their chests for a few moments, and they instinctively reached for their bear spray, which was attached to a holster on their hips. But the bear rushed at them. It covered the distance between them in less than a second and swiped with its huge, powerful paws. Aaron was sent crashing to the ground, and the bear immediately leapt on top of her. In a desperate attempt to save her colleague, Ellen sprayed the bear in its face as it tucked into Aaron. The bear shook its head and stepped backwards momentarily before lunging at them again. It tore into Aaron, but as Ellen continued to release her bear spray and yell and shout, the bear turned its attention to her. It let go of Aaron, who had been badly mauled, and jumped on top of Ellen. The attack was ferocious and unforgiving. The bear wasn't afraid of the 2 women. It was intent on causing as much damage as quickly as possible. The 2 women were fighting back, but it seemed like nothing they did deterred the bear. It continued its powerful attack, biting and clawing at the 2 women, though Aaron got the brunt of it. Teeth bit into her head, neck, and shoulders. The long, sharp claws sliced across her chest and torso. The sound of the bear growling as it mauled the 2 women over and over filled their ears, a terrifying sound of a great predator devouring its meal. In all the commotion, Ellen lost her glasses. She was now fighting blind. She lost sight of Aaron, and she lost sight of the bear. With all the shouting and hitting back, the bear retreated. It skulked away, looking back over its shoulder at its injured prey. Hurriedly, Ellen grabbed the radio and transmitted a mayday call. They were just 8 kilometers from the mine, and within minutes they heard the whirring of a helicopter high over the trees. Ellen didn't move. She was lying unresponsive on the ground. As the helicopter lowered a winch down, Ellen was lifted into the sky and back to the mine, where she was transported by ambulance to hospital in Fairbanks. The helicopter then returned for Aaron, but she was nowhere to be seen. An employee from Pogo Mine was lowered to the ground to search for her. He could see the disturbed earth where the 2 women had put up a fight. He could see spatters of blood and the scattered equipment across the ground. Then he noticed a trail. The vegetation had been flattened where something or someone had been dragged. Cautiously, he followed it, with his rifle locked and loaded. Just yards along the trail, he spotted the bear standing over Aaron's body. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired at the bear. It slumped to the ground, and he raced to Aaron's side. She was gone. Tragically, she had lost her life in the great outdoors. Although she had been doing something she loved, she was taken far too young. The news of her passing was a shock for those working for the mine and a terrible and irreplaceable loss for her family. Only a few weeks earlier, Aaron had married the love of her life and best friend, Abe. They were embarking on their new lives together when the tragedy struck, and now Abe would have to navigate his life without Aaron by his side. Her family described her as a beautiful, compassionate, and passionate person who lived her life to the fullest. The Department of Fish and Game investigated the incident. From what Ellen described and from the evidence found at the scene, the two women had been victims of a predatory attack. These attacks are incredibly rare and are the most dangerous. Very little can be done if you are unknowingly being stalked by a bear, as they use the element of surprise to creep up on you before delivering a highly aggressive and powerful attack. Often the attack is too sudden to deploy the use of bear spray or a gun. After recovering in hospital from her injuries, Ellen was able to provide more details of the attack. She described how she sprayed the bear extensively in the face, but to no avail. The bear wasn't deterred by the spray and ensued its hyper-aggressive attack on the two women. It was intent on killing them, and nothing, it seemed, would stop it from succeeding. As news of the attack spread, those living in Alaska were deeply concerned. It was the second fatal mauling by a bear in the state in the same week. Only days earlier, a 16-year-old boy had been killed in a predatory attack whilst he ran in a cross-country race south of Anchorage. A further 2 attacks occurred 1 week later, but the victims managed to escape with their lives. Alaska had only ever recorded 6 fatal bear attacks in the previous 130 years. Then, all of a sudden, 4 attacks, 2 of which were fatal, came along at once, all within a couple of weeks of each other. Fear swept through the communities. Could the bears be learning that people were easy prey? Where they had once been fearful of people, turning the other way when they crossed paths, were they now realizing that people were slower and easier to take down than their typical food? The Alaska Department of Fish and Game urged people to carry bear spray or a gun when out in the wilderness. They tried to ease people's fears after the recent and deadly attacks by describing them as incredibly rare. Brown bears are more notoriously aggressive than black bears, but typically that is only when they are protecting their young. They advised Alaskans to stand their ground if they come across a bear and talk firmly to it rather than run away or play dead. If the bear attacks, they said, it is best to throw rocks or hit it around the face. Sadly, none of this advice worked for Erin, who sadly met her terrifying final affliction. Going on hikes into the wilderness can be one of the great ways to get out into nature, relax, and get back in touch with your roots. But the great outdoors is also full of great dangers. In some countries, there are lots of wild animals who could do a great deal of damage to those who don't fully understand the danger that they could pose. Animals such as mountain lions, wolves, and all sorts of species of bear. And when these animals get scared or hungry, people can, unfortunately, be the ones who find themselves on the menu. This is unfortunately what happened to one man in Alaska back in 2018. Alaska is one of the truly wild places left in the world. About 95% of National Park Service land in Alaska has some wilderness protection and accounts for about 30% of the nation's wilderness. The state of Alaska has more than 57 million acres of designated wilderness with multiple different landscapes, including watersheds, mountain ranges, glaciers, wetlands, coastlines, volcanoes, tundra, forests, and wild and scenic rivers. It is one of the few places in the United States that has large, intact natural landscapes. These large areas allow ecosystems to function naturally This includes mass migrations of caribou and the natural disturbance of fire that creates a mosaic of vegetation communities. Large, naturally functioning ecosystems are also more resilient too and allow species to better adapt to climate change. Because these are areas where wildlife is able to flourish, animals, such as bears, like to make it their home. In fact, a bear is one of the easiest animals to see in Alaska, since there are more bears than in any other state or province in North America. There are actually more than 40,000 grizzly bears and 100,000 black bears roaming wild. In Alaska, there are 4 different types of bear: the brown bear, otherwise known as the grizzly, polar bears, black bears, and the glacier bear. And whilst it is always amazing to see these creatures from a distance, it's a completely different feeling when they are up close and personal. For one person, things ended in one of the worst possible ways. The man, called Mike Soltis, lived in Eagle River with his fiancée, Elizabeth Claus, a community in Alaska named for the river that it is situated on. Mike loved where he lived, as he found the awe-inspiring landscape around him to be very refreshing for his soul. Mike loved to go out hiking into the woods and surrounding landscapes, as it helped him calm down after a stressful day. It was during one of these excursions into the woods that Mike came face to face with the one thing that he would never want to see. It had started off as a relatively normal hike. Mike had been excited to get out and see all the different kinds of animals and other wonders of the natural world that he could. He was walking near the end of Highland Road in Eagle River when he suddenly spotted a brown bear. Shocked, Mike froze where he was standing. He knew that brown bears were dangerous. As well as their sheer immense size, they also have the quickest forelegs, meaning that they can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. And even though their teeth aren't the biggest, they are incredibly sharp. The bite force of a brown bear measures at 975 psi, which is the strength between that of a lion and a tiger. Indeed, this is the one animal that Mike really didn't want to run into. At first, Mike tried to keep incredibly still, hoping that the bear wouldn't notice him and that it would go away. However, he had no such luck. Upon hearing Mike, the bear instantly turned to look at him. It is not known what actually set the bear off, whether it was being territorial and thought that Mike was trying to challenge it, or whether the man simply spooked the animal, which caused it to act out in order to try and protect itself. Despite being omnivores, which means that they will eat both meat and plants such as berries, plant roots, and shrubs, small mammals, fish, calves, and many hoofed animals, brown bears usually won't attack humans. Unfortunately for Mike, he seemed to have stumbled upon a bear who was easily spooked. Within seconds, the huge brown bear began charging at Mike, and in just a split second, its entire 300-pound body was upon him. The bear began to maul Mike, biting and growling and clawing at him with its razor-sharp teeth and claws. Mike desperately tried to fight for his life, trying to scream for help and escape from the bear's unrelenting attack, but he was simply too weak to get the huge creature off of him. The only thing that Mike could feel in that moment was utter terror and a sense of regret that he knew these were likely his last few moments. A few days passed by and people began to worry about Mike. No one had seen him since he went on his hike the previous Monday. With this information, a search and rescue team made up of his family and a few volunteers was assembled to try and find Mike on the following Wednesday. Mike's cousin, Wendy Yoham, and 2 other people were searching near to where Highland Road ends, when all of a sudden, a huge brown bear burst out of the bushes and charged at the group of searchers. The volunteers had found the body of Mike, but it seemed as if the bear was actually guarding it. The huge animal charged at the group. As Wendy looked into its eyes as it sprinted towards her, she could see just how crazy the animal seemed to be. It was almost as if the bear had lost all of its fear of people and was simply on the hunt and protecting what it thought to be its belongings. Wendy braced herself, hoping that it wouldn't hurt too much when the bear finally attacked her. But just as she was about to be crushed by the animal, one of the other volunteers who was with her pushed her out of the way. The bear, not caring who was in front of it, began attacking the man instead. It clamped its razor-sharp teeth down onto the volunteer's leg, mauling it badly. Thankfully, the 3 searchers were able to scare the bear off by creating a lot of noise and yelling at it. They were able to chase it off for long enough to get the injured man moved to the nearest road, where they were able to flag down a driver to call for help. The volunteers were taken back to Mike's house, where they put a tourniquet on the injured man's leg. Once they had done that, they were able to call the police, who rushed to the scene. Along with the police, searchers from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game went hunting for the bear. Because it had fatally wounded one man and mauled another, the animal was clearly a danger to humans, and they knew that they had to catch it to make sure that it didn't hurt anyone else. The only problem was that they were unsure where the animal had gone, but they were determined to find the bear. It was clear that the animal wasn't acting normal, meaning that it could be infected with something like rabies. If the department didn't find it, then there was a very real chance that the disease could spread and affect other animals, which could then possibly infect humans as well. After a few hours of grueling search, the searchers were able to locate the bear not too far from where it had made its 2 attacks. They then determined that the animal was too dangerous to relocate to somewhere else in the wild, as it had already hurt 2 people, and so they had to humanely euthanize it. It was not released as to why the bear suddenly began acting so strange. However, there were thankfully no other reports of dangerous bears in the area, so the people of the community were once again at ease. As well as that, the man who was mauled was thankfully able to recover, although he did suffer quite a few scars to his leg. Elizabeth Claus, the fiancée of the late Mike Soltis, is now facing an incredibly challenging and heartbreaking situation. The tragic incident that claimed Mike's life in a bear mauling left her without her beloved partner, just when they were preparing to embark on a new journey together. Elizabeth had been eagerly anticipating her marriage to Michael, a milestone that symbolizes love, commitment, and the start of a new life together. They were also expecting the joy of welcoming a child into their lives, a moment that should have been filled with happiness and anticipation. However, the loss of Michael had turned what should have been a joyous time into one of profound grief and sorrow. This sudden tragedy has left Elizabeth as a single parent-to-be, navigating the complexities of pregnancy and parenthood without the support and companionship of her partner. The emotional toil of losing a loved one is already overwhelming, and the added responsibility of raising a child alone can be an immense challenge. The memory of Mike Soltis will undoubtedly continue to be a significant part of Elizabeth's life, as she cherishes the moments they shared and the love they had for each other. Her child will forever be a constant reminder of Mike and the memories they shared together before his terrifying, final affliction. The Alaska wilderness is different from the rest of the world. It is one of the last few places on Earth that have intact natural landscapes. This is why the National Park Service protects 95% of the land, accounting for 30% of the United States' entire wilderness. The 57 million acres of land include watersheds, glaciers, volcanoes, and rivers. One of the most scenic places in the state is Snowshoe Lake, located north of Glen Highway, 38 miles west of Glen Allen, Copper River Basin. Amongst the beautiful scenery and the picturesque pine trees decorating Snowshoe Lake, a most fearsome predator lurks in the shadows. The grizzly bear is one of the most dangerous creatures on Earth, and Alaska is its kingdom. Those who dare to experience the immaculate scenery of Snowshoe Lake should be willing to accept the possibility of encountering these menacing predators. During the 1950s, a man by the name of Lloyd Pennington and his friend Everett Kendall were out in the wilderness to hunt for these majestic and dangerous creatures. However, the 2 men became the unfortunate victims of a large grizzly bear gone insane, and instead were found dead. It was early April 1956. The typical Alaskan weather was approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and there were only a couple of hours of daylight. It was the tail end of winter, and the northern lights could be viewed in the sky. Meanwhile, the vast landscape was peppered with enough snow that winter activities could still be done. Waiting for Lloyd at the runway was a small plane typically used in these types of reconnaissance. Lloyd was a simple man, a professional guide who loved to watch brown bears emerging from their long winter hibernation. He also loved hunting them. However, he didn't plan on doing so today. He was just scouting the area. The thick vegetation was quite hard to navigate through, so flying a plane across the landscape was the way to go. The sounds of the engine whizzed across the alluring Alaskan backcountry, disturbing the pine leaves swaying along the runway. Lloyd applied back pressure to the yoke, and the plane's nose began to rise as it sped through the dusty asphalt of the road. A few seconds later, the plane took off, taking Lloyd into the sky. He flew over the rich green forests outlining the hills and mountains. The various kinds of trees such as Sitka spruce, western hemlock, tamarack, white birch, and western red cedar moved back and forth in agreement with the early April winds. Reaching Snowshoe Lake, Lloyd's eyes scanned over the scrubs below. Suddenly, there in plain and perfect view, the 56-year-old professional guide found what he was looking for. It was a large grizzly bear approaching 8 feet in length. Although he was ways away from the ground, Lloyd could see the glistening, melting snow on the bear's fur as it had just finished hibernating. The bear got out of its large den, hidden amongst the undergrowth, and stretched out its massive paws. It paced toward nearby nutrient-rich vegetation, slowly revealed by the receding snow. Jackpot, Lloyd thought. This bear would be a suitable hunt for his friend and barber, Everett Kendall. The two hunted together in the past, and this would be Everett's 5th hunt with Lloyd. Remembering where the den was located, Lloyd went back to schedule the hunt for an upcoming day when Everett was free. Unbeknownst to him, this would be a grave mistake. A week had passed since Lloyd scouted the nearby area. He proceeded to contact Everett, who had long expressed his desire to bag a large game like this one. All the hunting trips they've done in the past would pale in comparison to this one. However, it didn't end well for these two, as we would later find out. After the two communicated, Everett set out and met with Lloyd over at Taslina Lodge, where they spent the night. Tomorrow morning was the day they both awaited. The air was cold, but there was no chance of rain. It was April 16, 1956, and Lloyd and Everett were out to hunt the massive bear. As the two walked toward the runway, they were greeted by a small plane. They checked everything necessary for the hunting trip: rifles, bags, and the minimum equipment needed to navigate through the cold and beautiful terrain. With everything in place, Lloyd taxied the plane into position and sped through the runway. With minor adjustments to the plane, a few clicks, and a bit of pressure on the yoke, the two hunters took off. The familiar sound of the engines echoed through the strips of Alaskan trees. They had seen everything before. However, Lloyd and Everett marveled once more at the gorgeous Alaskan wilderness sprinkled with sparse, receding snow. Unbeknownst to them, it would be the last time they'd see this sight. Up in the air, the two could see everything. They eventually reached the den, with Lloyd pointing below, mentioning to Everett where they'd find the unwitting bear. Lloyd steered the plane into the direction of the wind, landing near the familiar den among the scrubs on a hillside above Snowshoe Lake. The two disengaged their seatbelts, grabbed their rifles and binoculars, and disembarked on their hunt. With the plane's engines turned off, the sounds of the Alaskan wilderness permeated the atmosphere and engulfed Lloyd and Everett. The marvelous noise of the rivers, birds, and other animals encircled the two men. Marching up the sparsely iced trail, the two men kept a close eye on the hillside above them to prevent any potentially deadly encounters with predators other than the bear they were hunting. They huffed and puffed the cold air, reeling from the exhaustion of climbing the few hundred feet trail. Every now and again they would pause and appreciate the sacred scenery. However, they stopped themselves from being distracted and made their way to the entrance of the den where the bear was still residing. The two camped out and began to pick up sticks in the area, planning on prodding the newly emerged bear. Coming out of hibernation, the creature was supposed to be bewildered, hungry, and easy to hunt. Although this was a tradition done by hunters in the past, it was a deadly undertaking. Death often comes to the uninitiated. Unwittingly, Lloyd and Everett were dancing with death. Waiting by the nearby tree, the two men shared a smoke while planning their move, how they would shoot the bear and the best way to recover the body. Grabbing long sticks from the surrounding area, the two prodded around the den, literally poking the bear. The plan was to shoot the creature once it emerged from the entrance. As Lloyd and Everett continued to poke around the den, they eventually heard a sound. However, there was no time for the two to be optimistic. The plan was supposed to work, assuming the bear was weary and slow-moving. Unfortunately, what came out of that hellish entrance was anything but that. Without warning, the massive creature made its way toward the entrance and a few feet from Everett. In a blink of an eye, the two men were face to face with death. Everett scrambled in panic and began unloading his rifle toward the creature. However, 5 hunting trips built in him a false sense of confidence. All the shots missed, and the bear was raging towards him. The bear swatted at the rifle and grabbed hold of Everett's shoulders. The bear's massive jaws bit down on Everett's head, pinning him with its weight. The leaves on the ground sprang up into the air as the commotion worsened. Everett's screams echoed through the silent Alaskan wilderness, a place where nobody could find them. Lloyd scrambled for his rifle, attempting to shoot the creature while Everett was mercilessly mauled. He took away his sight from the bear for a while, focusing on adjusting the gun's safety lock. However, before he could point and unload, the creature was already gazing at him. Lloyd froze in terror and despair. For a split second, he could see Everett's lifeless body underneath the bear's paws. The creature's claws were red, painting the ground with Everett's blood. In a blink of an eye, the few meters of distance between Lloyd and the bear disappeared. The massive predator grabbed hold of Lloyd's leg and bit him repeatedly. The sharp canines tore into his flesh, cutting his muscles and joints like a hot knife through butter. The bear knocked Lloyd down, exposing him to more danger. All Lloyd could do at this point was protect his face by raising his arms. However, this was pointless, as the bear bit into his forearms and tore them to shreds. In one swift motion, the bear reached for Lloyd's neck and gnawed at his throat and head. Lloyd became lifeless in just a matter of seconds. The two hunters became the hunted. The two men disappearing initiated a search. A bush pilot spotted their bodies and reported the incident to authorities in Anchorage. Consequently, 10 heavily armed hunters were deployed in the area to find the culprit bear, following closely the trail that Lloyd and Everett walked through. The hunters cornered the bear and shot it to death. Lloyd and Everett's bodies strewed near the den's entrance. The ground around them was torn from the commotion. It was unfortunate that the two men died from something that could have been prevented. The bear also had to suffer, even though it was just protecting itself and acting according to its nature. The two men found exactly what they were looking for that day, but the tables were turned. They were ripped apart by a ferocious bear. It had come out victorious against 2 armed men with guns trying to kill it in his den, only to spark revenge on the bear, bringing it to its tragic final affliction. It was a sunny day on Chichagof Island in southeast Alaska. This place is one of the ABC Islands in Alaska, constituting Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof. Although it is the 5th largest island in the United States, it has a mere population of only over 1,000 people, making it one of the last remaining grizzly bear strongholds. The rich vegetation of pine, fir, alder, willow, and blueberry decorates the vast landscape, concealing the teeming population of bears. In fact, this immaculate backdrop holds more bears per square mile than any other place on Earth. Chichagof Island is a bear paradise. To support the vast ecosystem on the island, an equally enormous collection of rainforest trees must be maintained to ensure the untainted beauty of the island is kept that way. Consequently, the forestry sector steps in. A large portion of the island is protected by the United States Forest Service, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that manages more than 190 million acres of land in the country. October 11, 2012. The chattering of people, forest rangers, and wildlife specialists permeated the Alaskan hush on Chichagof Island. Many workers here had been from around the country, some living a couple of miles away. That was the case of Tomas, a Sitka resident for 25 years. However, it wasn't always the case. As a young man, he lived in various other states before finally settling down in the town of Sitka in 1987. A big fan of the outdoors, the cowboy hat and boots-wearing 54-year-old worked as a tree thinner for the Tongass National Forest, playing a vital role in the Alaskan forest upkeep. During the midday meeting, the workers realized they were running out of groceries and other supplies. Working in the forestry sector meant living near forested areas and away from civilization. This meant supplies and other daily essentials must be bought in bulk and carried to the worksite. In other cases, this may not seem like a big undertaking. However, for the workers at Chichagof Island, it was a 2.5-hour round-trip drive across chilly waters. The workers nominated Tomas to make the long run this time. As someone who enjoyed hunting, fishing, and riding motorcycles, the hardy man, Tomas, happily granted his co-worker's request. The waters were clear blue on this Thursday mid-afternoon. The coastline of Chichagof Island met the Peril Strait, a long stretch of Alaskan waters in the Alexander Archipelago, southeastern Alaska. Peppered with islets and coves, the 80-kilometer length is filled with twisting waterways and treacherous tidal currents. However, they were the least of your worries, as the strait houses sloping beaches, perfect for brown bears to live, hunt, and reproduce. Beyond the alluring scenery of Peril Strait hides a dark history. Also known in its translation as Proliv Pogibshi, the strait was named by Russians during a fur-sealing hunting expedition in 1799 that ended in disaster. During the hunt, the men ate poisonous shellfish from the channel, resulting in approximately 150 deaths. It could be argued that the same ominous force, which annihilated the men in 1799, was at play as Tomas prepped the 13-foot-long skiff. The lightweight boat was only ideal for a few people traveling and fishing. It had a single engine running around a couple of miles per hour. The mixture of flexible and fragile material for the skiff's hull was the only thing standing between Tomas and utter danger. Pushing ahead, Tomas made his way to the clear waterways, sighting the beautiful little coves and islets that were so distinctly Alaska along the way. Eventually, the coastline up ahead was a welcoming sight for Tomas. He docked the skiff and proceeded to head toward the grocery store. It was a short trip, as he already had the list of what was needed back at camp. Tomas roamed the grocery and carefully picked out the necessary food and supplies. Tomas reached the cashier, paid for the goods, and carried the groceries to the docked skiff, carefully loading them. Tomas thought he would be back to see his campmates' happy faces sooner than expected. The lightweight boat heaved across Peril Strait once again, pushing along the path Tomas already took hours ago. Despite living in Alaska for approximately 25 years, Tomas still could not help but appreciate the earnest, almost divine picture of the Alaskan wilderness in plain and perfect view in the daylight. Unbeknownst to him, this was the last time he would ever see this. Tomas was pulling up near Poison Cove. Suddenly, against the tricky tides of Peril Strait, the skiff's engine became impaired. What a drag, Tomas thought. He tried pulling the engine again, hoping to resurrect it, but it had given up on him. As he made an attempt to fix it, Tomas looked around him. The way the currents were behaving, Tomas realized he could not stay motionless in the river for too long. The pretty strait was a femme fatale, after all. Using the last few breaths of the engine, Tomas swerved toward the Poison Cove coastline. He hoped to regain his wits and find a way around the engine failure. He pulled the skiff aside and unloaded the grocery bags. A few minutes had passed, and Tomas was able to get his tools out, trying to get the engine working again. Unfortunately, his vulnerable disposition exposed him to the dangers of the wilderness nearby. This was bear paradise, after all. Without any firearm or bear spray, Tomas was utterly defenseless. This was by no means his fault, though, since Tomas had only planned on traveling through the strait. Well, bears do not typically hunt people on boats. Under the mid-afternoon heat, Tomas lifted the boat's engine hood and began tinkering. Almost an hour into this, however, the weather had suddenly gotten too chilly. Tomas felt the cold wind pervading through his bones, prompting him to drop what he was doing and decide on a different plan. Tomas looked at his surroundings. He saw the lush vegetation scattered across, fading toward the background as he looked farther ahead. Having a campfire to combat the cold was a great idea. Tomas decided to venture into the nearby forest to fetch some wood. Shortly after, he started a campfire. The calm view of the strait, coupled with the warmth of the campfire, made for a relaxing stay. Tomas suddenly felt his stomach screaming at him. He pulled one of the grocery bags aside, opened it, and decided to eat while waiting for a passing boat to rescue him. Worst case scenario, his workmates would notice he hasn't come back yet, prompting them to search the area for him. However, that was not going to happen. Beyond the tree line, a deep bellowing permeated the quiet sundown. Its paws, the size of 2 adult human hands, pressed around the underbrush, careful not to make any noise. The bear took a whiff of the atmosphere, ensuring its target was near. Tomas had no idea that the massive creature was only a couple feet away. After sizing him up, the bear huffed and pounded its front paws on the ground, ready for an attack. It charged toward its target like a freight train. All its bones and muscles propelled it forward, and the bear moved and covered the distance in mere seconds. Tomas noticed something was wrong. However, before he realized the direness of his situation, it was too late. The bear's mighty jaws, lined with 4-inch razor-sharp incisors, clamped on his shoulder, and he let out a deafening scream. He used his hands and pounded against the beast. However, it was no use. The couple 100-pound predator couldn't feel as much as a tickle. It grabbed hold of Tomas with its powerful paws. Tomas fought as hard as he could. He thought about his family, his wife, son, and daughter, the ranch in Mexico. His feet painted desperate furrows in the sand as the predator began pulling him toward the trees. Tomas knew if he crossed that area, there wouldn't be any hope left for him. He struggled and used all his strength to pull against the ferocious beast. However, it was no use. Tomas put up a good fight. He was a hardy man after all, but the bear was too powerful. The creature pulled him toward the trees, and just like that, 54-year-old Tomas Puerta disappeared. Eventually, after realizing he hadn't returned, Tomas's campmates reported him missing to officials. It was Sunday, October 14th, almost 4 days since he went out on a grocery run. The workmates were seriously worried. Various searches were done across Peril Strait, where he supposedly went through. Some people volunteered to join in on the rescue mission. Consequently, a Good Samaritan vessel approached Poison Cove and noticed an unusually docked skiff. As people went down to investigate, they saw a campsite with evidence of a struggle. Following the trail of disturbance through the trees, responders reached a bear cache. Suddenly, they were confronted by a large female grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. As the beast acted aggressively toward them, the group decided to head back and phone authorities about their find. When responders arrived at the scene, the bear and her 2 cubs were missing. Nearby, they spotted what they had been looking for. It was the partially eaten remains of Tomas. Eventually, Alaska State Troopers and Sitka Mountain Rescue secured the kill site. They planned on hunting the bear and eventually did. Sadly, that was what became of Tomas Puerta. Although bears are dangerous creatures, attacks on people have never been that common, even on Chichagof Island. Unfortunately, because of the large population in the area, it was only a matter of time before an incident like this happened. One of the world's deadliest predators brutally mauling you as you approach your unfortunate final affliction.